50 years old. That was the age when a man was supposed to be looking at his legacy, sitting by a fire he had built, watching the seasons turn from the comfort of a chair that knew the shape of his back. It was not the age to be standing on the wrong side of a heavy oak door, listening to the iron latch slide home with a finality that sounded like a gunshot. Thorne stood on the porch, the wind cutting through his coat as if it were made of lace, staring at the wood grain of the door he had hung himself 20 years ago. The rejection had not been loud. It hadn't been a screaming match or a brawl that spilled out into the yard. It had been quiet, cold, and calculated. Harlan, his younger brother, had simply waited until the deed was transferred, until the ink was dry and the winter had set its teeth into the valley, before stating that there was no longer room at the table for a man who couldn't keep pace with the new ways. Thorne didn't shout. He didn't pound on the timber. He simply turned around and looked out at the gray expanse of the Montana Territory, the snow beginning to drift against the porch railing. He had a horse, a bedroll, and exactly $5 in his pocket. The shame of it sat heavy in his gut, colder than the wind. He didn't feel angry. He felt hollowed out, scraped clean like a cured hide. This wasn't the kind of betrayal you fought with fists. This was the kind that rearranged your entire understanding of the world. He walked to the barn, his boots crunching on the hard-packed frost, and saddled the mare, Bess. She was old, too. They were two obsolete things being cast out into a world that had no patience for slowness. As he rode past the gate, he didn't look back at the ranch house, with its smoking chimney and glowing windows. He looked forward, toward the jagged line of the mountains and the fading light, his mind numb, refusing to process the reality that at 50, he was starting over with less than he had at 20. The wind howled, a low, mournful sound that seemed to be laughing at him, tearing at the brim of his hat. He was homeless. He was alone, and the thermometer was dropping. The town of Blackwood was not a place of charity. It was a collection of rough-hewn buildings huddled together against the harsh landscape, populated by people who measured a man's worth by the callus on his hands and the weight of his coin purse. Thorne rode in as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and charcoal. He didn't go to the saloon. He didn't go to the boarding house. He went to the land office, a cramped shack that smelled of stale tobacco and dry paper. The agent, a thin man with watery eyes named Miller, looked up from his ledger with a sneer that barely concealed his surprise. Thorne asked for land. Not good land. Not grazing land. Just anything that a man with $5 could put his name on. Miller had laughed, a dry, rattling sound. He pulled a map from under the counter and pointed to a spot miles outside of town, up near the scree slopes where the wind hit the hardest. There was a structure there, Miller claimed. A homestead that had been abandoned 10 years prior after the previous owner froze to death. It was a broken thing, a ruin that the town had forgotten. The price was exactly $5, not because it was worth that much, but because that was the fee for the filing paper. Thorne didn't hesitate. He slapped the bills onto the counter, the last of his lifeline. It was a foolish choice, a desperate choice. A younger man would have saved the money for food or a ticket east. But Thorne wasn't a young man. He was a stubborn root that refused to be pulled. He took the deed, his hands trembling slightly not from fear, but from the sheer audacity of what he was doing. He rode out to the property in the dark, the moon casting long, skeletal shadows across the snow. When he arrived, his heart sank. The house was a carcass. The roof was caved in on one side, the windows were gaping maws with no glass, and the front door was hanging by a single rusted hinge. It wasn't a shelter. It was a tomb waiting for a tenant. But as Thorne stood there, shivering in the biting cold, he looked at the stone foundation. It was solid. It was deep. It was the only thing in his life that hadn't moved. He tied Bess to a sheltered post and stepped inside. The first night was a test of endurance that nearly broke him. The wind didn't just blow around the house. It blew through it, whistling through the gaps in the timber walls and swirling the dead leaves that had accumulated in the corners. Thorne had no fire. The chimney was choked with debris, a bird's nest of twigs and mud blocking the flue. To light a fire would be to smoke himself out into the freezing night. So he didn't light one. He huddled in the corner that offered the most protection, wrapped in his bedroll, his body pressed against the rough wood. He could see his breath in the moonlight that filtered through the broken roof, puffing out in rhythmic clouds that dissipated into the darkness. He thought of Harlan. He thought of the warm kitchen he had been banned from, the smell of roasting meat and fresh bread. The memory was a sharp pain, worse than the frostbite nipping at his toes. He realized then that he could die here. It would be easy. Just close his eyes, let the cold seep into his bones, and drift away. No one would miss him. Miller would just sell the deed again for another $5 to the next fool. But then, a spark of something ancient and hard ignited in his chest. It was spite. It was pride. It was the refusal to let his brother be right. He sat up, shaking the stiffness from his limbs. He began to move. In the pitch black, he felt his way around the room, gathering loose boards, debris, anything he could find. He couldn't fix the roof tonight, but he could build a windbreak. He stacked rotting planks against the corner, creating a smaller, tighter space. He stuffed the cracks with frozen mud he chipped from the floor. He worked until his hands were raw and bleeding, until the sweat froze on his brow. He wasn't building a home yet. He was building a coffin that he could survive in. He didn't sleep. He waited. He waited for the sun with the patience of a predator, his eyes fixed on the horizon through the gaps in the wall. When the first gray light of dawn touched the snow, Thorne was still alive. He stood up, his joints popping, and looked at his work. It was ugly. It was desperate, but it had held the wind at bay. Hunger arrived on the second day, a dull ache that sharpened into a clawing emptiness as the sun rose high and cold. Thorne had no food. He had water from the snow he melted, but water didn't put strength back into muscles that had been shivering for 12 hours. He needed supplies, but he had spent his last dollar on the ruin he was standing in. He needed to trade. He rode Bess back into town, the horse moving slowly, her head low. Thorne looked like a specter, his eyes sunken, his face covered in gray stubble. He tied Bess outside the general store and walked in. The bell above the door chimed, a cheerful sound that felt out of place. The owner, a bear of a man named Orrin, was behind the counter, weighing nails. He looked at Thorne, taking in the worn coat, the empty holster, the desperation that radiated off him like heat. Orrin didn't smile. He was a practical man who had seen too many dreamers come and go. Thorne didn't beg. He walked to the counter and placed his hands on the wood. He told Orrin he needed nails, a hammer, a saw, and a sack of flour. Orrin asked for coin. Thorne said he had none. The silence that followed was heavy. Thorne didn't look down. He looked Orrin in the eye and spoke of his skills. He told him about the fences he had built that still stood after 30 years. He told him about the barns he had raised that hadn't shifted an inch. He offered his labor. He would fix Orrin's loading dock, which sagged to the left. He would shoe the mules in the stable. He would chop the winter wood. Orrin looked at the loading dock, then back at Thorne. He saw the pride there. He saw the calluses that were thick as leather. This wasn't a beggar. This was a craftsman who had fallen. Orrin nodded, once. He gave Thorne the tools and the flour, but he kept a ledger. Every nail is a debt, Orrin said, his voice gravel. You pay it back in sweat, or I take the horse, Thorne agreed. He walked out with the weight of the tools in his arms, feeling heavier than he had with the money. It wasn't charity. It was a contract. And for the first time in days, he felt the weight of possibility. The return to the shack marked the shift from survival to war. The enemy was the elements, and Thorne was now armed. He started with the roof. It was dangerous work, climbing the slick, rotting beams with the wind trying to peel him off the structure. He stripped the bad wood, throwing it down to be used for fuel. He salvaged what he could, pulling nails from the decay with a grim determination. He wasn't a carpenter by trade. He was a rancher. But on the frontier, the lines blurred. A man did what needed doing. He worked with a rhythm that defied his age. Hammer, breath, strike. Hammer, breath, strike. The sound echoed off the mountains, a lonely, rhythmic defiance in the vast silence. People passing on the road below, travelers and trappers, stopped to watch. They saw the silhouette of the old man on the roof of the haunted shack, fighting against the gray sky. They shook their heads. "Dead by midwinter," they whispered. Crazy old fool. Thorn heard them. The wind carried their voices. He didn't stop. He didn't look down. He drove another nail. By the time the storm front rolled in that evening, heavy with the promise of deep snow, he had patched the worst of the hole. It wasn't pretty. It was a patchwork of mismatched timber and tar paper he had found in the debris. But when he went inside and lit the fire in the newly cleared hearth, the smoke drew up the chimney. The heat stayed in the room. He sat on a crate, chewing on a hard biscuit made from the flour and water, and watched the firelight dance on the rough walls. For the first time since he left his brother's house, the shivering stopped. He wasn't warm, not truly, but he was dry, and the roof above him, ugly and scarred, was his. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, the image of the ranch house didn't hurt. Felt distant. He was 50 years old, he had $5 of debt, and he was alone. But as the fire crackled, snapping against the silence, Thorn felt something stir in the quiet. It wasn't hope. Not yet. It was the stubborn, iron-willed refusal to simply disappear. The house groaned in the wind, settling onto its foundation, and Thorn settled with it. He was staying. The weeks that followed dragged on with the slow, grinding cruelty of a millstone, grinding Thorn down to the very gristle of his spirit. January arrived not with a shout, but with a silence so profound it felt heavy, a physical weight pressing against the eardrums. The snow was no longer just weather. It was architecture, banking up against the walls of the shack until the windows were half-buried tunnels of gray light. Inside, the world had shrunk to the 12-foot radius of the hearth's warmth. Thorn had ceased to be a rancher or a brother, or even a citizen of the territory. He had become an organism existing entirely for the sake of the next hour. The fuel supply was a constant, gnawing anxiety. Every log he burned was a calculation, a wager placed against the duration of the night. When the firewood stack dwindled to a few damp knots of pine, Thorn had to make choices that felt like amputations. He looked at the few pieces of furniture that had been left in the ruin by the dead predecessor. A shattered chair, a table with 3 legs. He didn't see history. He saw heat. He broke them down with his hatchet, the dry wood snapping with a violence that echoed in the empty room. But the cold was not the only enemy. The isolation was a sharper blade. A man can go hungry for days, but silence, true absolute silence, begins to eat at the mind. He found himself talking to the walls, to the fire, but mostly to Bess. The mare was stabled in the lean-to he had reinforced against the side of the house, but the temperature had dropped to a point where the air itself seemed to crack. One night, hearing her distress through the timber, Thorn didn't hesitate. He unlatched the door, letting a blast of sub-zero air scream into the room, and led the horse inside. It was an act that would have been unthinkable in his brother's house. Livestock in the parlor, but here the rules of civilization had evaporated. Bess stood by the fire, her coat matted with ice, her breath mixing with his. They were 2 refugees huddled together in the belly of a wooden whale. Thorn slept with his back against her flank, borrowing her warmth, giving her his. He realized then that he wasn't just maintaining a property. He was keeping a heartbeat going. The house smelled of wet horsehair, wood smoke, and unwashed wool. It wasn't dignified. It wasn't clean. But as the wind howled like a banshee outside, trying to tear the roof off the walls, the shared warmth in that dark room felt like the only holy thing left in the world. He was alive. She was alive. And for tonight, the storm could not touch them. By February, the stockpile of flour was gone, and the debt to Orrin hung over Thorn's head like a suspended anvil. He could not eat the house. He had to return to town. The ride down the mountain was a perilous descent through chest-deep drifts, the path erased by the wind. Thorn walked ahead of Bess for most of it, breaking the trail with his own body, his legs burning with lactic fire. When he finally reached Blackwood, he looked like a creature dredged from a frozen swamp. People stopped in the street to stare, not with mockery this time, but with a hushed, unnerved reverence. They had placed bets on his death. Seeing him walk out of the white wilderness, gaunt but vertical, unsettled them. He went straight to the general store. Orrin looked up, his face unreadable, and watched Thorn place the empty flour sack on the counter. Thorn didn't ask for credit. He asked for work. For the next 3 weeks, Thorn became a fixture in the town, though he never slept there. He rode down at dawn, worked until his muscles trembled, and rode back up to the shack in the twilight. He fixed the loading dock, replacing the rotted pilings with precise, unyielding joinery. He repaired the roof of the livery stable. He mended fences that had been snapped by the heavy snow. He worked with a silent, ferocious intensity that frightened the younger men. He wasn't working for money. He was working for materials. He traded hours of labor for a box of nails. He traded a fixed wagon wheel for a sack of beans. But the greatest prize, the one he saved his hardest labor for, was glass. He found 4 panes of glass in the back of Orrin's storage, dusty and forgotten. They were worth more than gold to a man living in a cave. When he finally earned them, after a week of hauling ice blocks from the frozen river, he carried them up the mountain wrapped in layers of burlap, terrified that a stumble would shatter his future. Installing them was a delicate surgery. He chiseled the frames, set the panes, and sealed them with a mixture of pine pitch and fat. The moment he stepped back was a revelation. For months, the outside world had been an enemy to be walled out. Now suddenly the light poured in. He could see the valley floor, the distant smoke of the town, the jagged peaks, all from the warmth of his fire. He sat in front of the window for hours, just watching the sun track across the sky. The house was no longer a blind box. It had eyes. It had become a vantage point. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was watching. The thaw was still weeks away when the test came, not for Thorn's survival but for his humanity. It began as a noise in the night, a faint, rhythmic thumping that wasn't the wind. Thorn was awake instantly, his hand closing around the handle of his hatchet. He moved to the window, peering out into the swirling dark. He saw nothing but the driving snow. Then a shout. Faint, desperate, torn away by the gale. Thorn didn't debate the safety of opening his door. He lit the lantern, pulled his coat tight, and stepped out into the crushing violence of the blizzard. He found them 50 yards from his porch. A wagon slid off the trail, a wheel shattered. A man and a woman huddled against the lee side of a dying mule. They were travelers, unprepared for the mountain's fury, freezing to death in plain sight of his sanctuary. Thorn didn't ask names. He didn't ask for payment. He grabbed the woman, who was too numb to walk, and carried her through the drifts to the house. He went back for the man, half dragging him across the ice. He brought them into the room where the fire was roaring. The shock on their faces was visceral, not just from the heat, but from the sight of the rough, cobbled-together interior that felt impossibly safe. Thorn moved with the efficiency of a field medic. He boiled water. He wrapped them in his own blankets. He fed them the last of his beans. For 3 days, the storm raged, trapping the 3 of them in the small space. The strangers, a young couple heading west to Oregon, looked at Thorn not as a failed rancher or a homeless drifter, but as a savior. They saw the house not as a ruin, but as a fortress. They watched him tend the fire, saw the care he took with every piece of wood, the way he checked the window seals. They saw a man who had mastered his environment. When the storm broke and the sky cleared to a piercing blue, the man tried to offer Thorn money. Thorn looked at the coins, then at the couple's battered wagon outside. He shook his head. "Keep it," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You'll need it for the pass." He helped them repair their wheel, using his own tools and wood. As they rode away, waving until they were specks in the distance, Thorn felt a strange sensation in his chest. It wasn't pride. It was utility. He wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a waypoint. He was the keeper of the fire on the mountain. The house had a purpose, and therefore so did he. Spring arrived with the roar of water. The snow that had tried to kill him for months turned into 1,000 rivulets, cascading down the slopes, feeding the earth. The valley turned a shocking, vibrant green, the color of new life. Thorn stepped out onto his porch, a porch he had rebuilt plank by plank, and breathed in air that smelled of wet soil and pine resin. He had survived. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had entered the winter as a ghost, and he had emerged as something solid. The town had changed its tune, too. The couple he saved had spoken of him in Blackwood. The story had traveled. The man on the ridge, they called him. Not the crazy old fool. When Thorn rode into town for supplies, men nodded to him. Orrin, the storekeep, slid a fresh sack of coffee across the counter. On the house? Orrin rumbled, not making eye contact. Heard you run a good hotel up there. It was a joke, dry and dusty, but it was also an offering of respect. Thorn took the coffee. He didn't smile, but the lines around his eyes softened. He rode back up to his land, passing the turnoff to his brother's ranch. He paused there, Bess shifting her weight beneath him. He looked down at the sprawling estate of his childhood, the big house where he was born, where he was kicked out. He saw Harlan in the yard, shouting at a stable hand, looking small and angry from this distance. Thorn waited for the old bitterness to rise, for the familiar sting of rejection. It didn't come. He felt nothing but a distant pity. Harlan was a prisoner of his own walls, guarding a legacy he hadn't earned. Thorn had built his world from $5 and a pile of rot. He turned Bess up the mountain path, toward the small, ugly, beautiful house that sat on the ridge. He began to work on the exterior. He didn't carve decorations or plant flowers. He built a stone wall along the front of the property. He hauled rocks from the creek bed, stacking them without mortar, fitting them together until they were immovable. It was a statement. I am here. I am rooted. This is mine. He wasn't waiting for permission to exist anymore. He had forged his existence with a hammer and the will to endure. The broken house was no longer broken. It was scarred, yes. It was weathered, but it stood straighter than anything in the valley. 2 years later, the house on the ridge was unrecognizable, yet exactly the same. The roof was tight and shingled with hand-split cedar. A sturdy barn stood where the lean-to had been. Smoke rose from the chimney in a steady, welcoming column that could be seen for miles. Thorn sat on the porch, a mug of coffee in his hand, watching the sun dip below the peaks. He was 52 now. His hands were gnarled like oak roots, his face lined by the wind and the sun, but his eyes were clear. He wasn't a rich man in coin. He still traded labor for goods, he still lived simply. But he possessed a wealth that his brother would never understand. Travelers stopped often now, not just when they were desperate, but because the house had become known as a place where the fire was always hot and the water was always fresh. He never turned anyone away. He listened to their stories, offered a quiet nod, and sent them on their way with a mended wheel or a full belly. He had taken a place of death, a place where a man had frozen alone, and turned it into a place of life. He looked at the deed, still pinned to the wall inside, the paper yellowing and brittle. $5. That was the price of the paper. But the cost had been everything else. His pride, his comfort, his past, his fear. He had paid it all, nail by nail, breath by breath. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, but the house didn't creak. It didn't groan. It held the silence with a comfortable strength. Thorn looked out past the railing, past the valley, and seemingly through the years. He knew something now that he hadn't known when he stood shivering on that porch the first night. He knew that a home isn't something you buy. It isn't something you inherit. It is something you build out of the wreckage of what you thought you needed. It is the thing that stands when everything else has been stripped away. And as the stars began to bleed into the twilight sky, the question wasn't whether he had succeeded. The question hung in the cool air, directed not at him, but at anyone watching a life crumble and wondering if it's worth the effort to pick up the hammer. When the world locks you out, and the cold comes, and you have nothing left but your own 2 hands and a broken ruin, do you lie down and freeze? Or do you stand up, strike a match, and begin the work of building a fire that the wind cannot blow out? Thorn took a sip of his coffee. The house was warm. The night was quiet. And he was home,